one of the rights of the speaker is to have a glass of water. Thank you very much, Onora. I have to say it's a real honour to be here and to have been invited by you to join you in Bergen for this occasion. I'm also very, very grateful to Ellen, Hilda Marie, the organisers of the Holberg Prize, and all the volunteers who've made our stay here very enjoyable. I have to just add to what Onora has already said and make a kind of confession and a kind of apology to those of you who are philosophers. I'm not a philosopher. Now, in the UK, there's no great shame in not being a philosopher. In fact, there is some shame in being a philosopher. I say that as the son of a philosopher. We treat our philosophers with disdain, I'm afraid, and even in some cases with contempt. We say they live in ivory towers, that they are idealists, dreamers, utopians, obscurantists. So at home, I might take some pride in not being a philosopher. But on this platform and in this company, I am slightly embarrassed about it. But on the other hand, our topic, communication, ethics, has great implications, as Onora has said, for what we non-philosophers like to call the real world. These questions are not abstract. We're asking what good is served by communication, and in particular, what good is served by the form of communication that we call news. We're asking what conditions need to be in place to achieve that good. Now, these challenges have obvious and immediate bearings on practical questions of media law and media policy, both at a national and perhaps at an international level. And furthermore, we're here because of Onora O'Neill, one of the most public of public intellectuals. With roles both at Cambridge and in the House of Lords, Onora is certainly not confined to the ivory tower. Her philosophical concerns are rooted in the challenges that face policymakers, and her policymaking, I believe, is rooted in her philosophical sensibility. So maybe it's appropriate that I'm here as a non-philosopher and that, like Onora, perhaps, I sit somewhere on the bridge between the academy and those other cultures in what we call the real world. But it's not always very comfortable to sit on a bridge. This particular bridge is not very well built and it's not very well looked after. Philosophers who cross the bridge into the real world may find it hard to return to the academy. And politicians and others who cross the bridge into the academy may be mocked by their peers for giving up on reality. There are perils at both ends of the bridge, and there are trolls lurking beneath the bridge anonymously, always happy to criticize anyone for anything at any time. Nonetheless, this bridge between academic philosophy and other cultures is fundamentally important to our society. Onora has shown how this bridge can be crossed in both directions. And today, I think I want to ask what can be done to strengthen this bridge, to enable more of us to cross it productively in both directions. Now, Onora's insight into press freedom and communication ethics has gained wide currency among both academics and policymakers in the UK. It underpins the framework for press regulation, which we've developed in this country, following the Leveson Inquiry into the culture, practices, and ethics of the press. However, Onora's account of press freedom has been almost entirely ignored by the press itself. Now, there may be obvious reasons for this. Newspaper publishers may not want to listen to anyone who calls on them to act more transparently or to take greater care to ensure that what they publish is accurate. However, there may also be more subtle reasons for the news industry's rejection of these ethics of or for communication. And these reasons, I suggest, go deep into the culture of the industry. Cultural factors which go beyond straightforward commercial self-interest. In fact, journalists on some occasions may well be acting against their self-interest when they reject this new ethical approach and its regulatory implications. So I want to talk briefly today about this clash between the ethics of communication as this emerges from academic philosophy and it comes via the courts and parliament, and the culture of communication as this has developed in newspaper newsrooms in the UK and around the world over the course of the 20th century. I want to suggest that whilst this clash may be very frustrating, even infuriating for some of us who are trying to work at the interface between these two worlds, nonetheless, we need to take it seriously. We need to take the drivers for this clash seriously. We need to attend to the cultural factors that make communication between these two worlds so difficult. And we should also seek to resolve this conflict. But I think we have to be realistic that this is a generational challenge and one that may not be won on the quality of argument alone. And in that, perhaps I'm posing a challenge to the philosophers here. Now look, my academic background, like Ellen's, was in literature, the study of literature, and then for many years I worked as a journalist and as a campaigner for press freedom. And in those days, looking back now, I have to say I think I led a rather simple life. I believed in the classical liberal orthodoxies: free speech, press freedom, the liberty that John Milton articulated to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. And as a journalist and activist, I defended the freedom of the press, even when some British newspapers made that quite difficult. I argued pretty staunchly that the rights of journalists outweighed other considerations. I quoted Milton, Mill, and Orwell, and anyone who dared to question this received wisdom. I didn't actually think of my beliefs as beliefs. I thought of them as truths. And then I met Onora O'Neill. And that was the end of my simple liberal life. And as it happens, I think, I may have misremembered this may be fake news, but I think we met over pizza in a small town in Scotland. We were there invited by Rowan, who's here today, to attend a conference at the University of Stirling. And the conference was designed to bring together human rights practitioners and scholars. I was there at that time as a campaigner, someone who got my hands dirty, and others were there as scholars blinking in the light of day. And I expected the scholars to treat the campaigners with some respect. After all, I thought we were the ones who did the real work. But Onora didn't show a huge amount of that kind of, well, certainly no deference. She took me to pieces. She argued that the ideal of press freedom, of which I was so proud to be an advocate, was flawed, both in its conception and in its articulation, its application. Now, I can't do full justice to Onora's arguments, and I'm hoping very much that she'll set them out for all of us this afternoon, but I'll try to summarize them. Milton had argued, as we know, that the press must be free from prior restraint in order to create the conditions in which intellectual and religious debate could flourish. He described, not in these terms, but he broadly described a marketplace of ideas. That language came later. But the marketplace of ideas in which freedom from restraints was both a necessary and, it seems, a sufficient condition for truth to emerge. Onora, by contrast, argued that this marketplace of ideas could not be such a libertarian one if it were to achieve its truth-seeking purpose. It could not be characterized only by freedom from restraint. She argued that if we are serious about helping truth to emerge, then that market must be organized in such a way as to make that possible. Freedom from prior restraint may be a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And she concluded that the modern conception of press freedom, in which the freedom of journalists and, by extension, newspaper owners is seen as paramount, that conception was so profoundly flawed as to represent almost a perfect reversal of what press freedom should achieve. By privileging the rights of such speakers, regardless of their commitment to truth or truth-seeking, and regardless of whether they're even human beings or multinational corporations, we in fact make it less likely that truth will emerge. And in effect, Onora turned press freedom on its head. She showed me at least, that the beneficiaries of that freedom, the rights holders, as it were, must be the recipients of news, not its producers, the audience, not the speaker. Now, this may sound like a philosophical nicety. How many angels does it take to dance on the head of a pin? But actually, I think the implications are tremendous. If we come at questions of media law and policy from the perspective of news publishers, we will devise an approach that primarily serves to protect their rights. That approach might incidentally protect the rights of others, but that won't be its main thrust. So we might, for instance, say that in order to protect the freedom of news publishers, they should not be externally regulated. Now, this might have the incidental benefit of ensuring that news publishers are not subject to political oversight. That, in turn, might help to ensure that the public received uncensored information about political goings-on. However, the lack of external regulation might also cause the public considerable harm, for example, through the publication of inaccurate or distorted information about political goings-on. Whether or not the public are actually served in this paradigm appears to be less important than the idea that they are served by a press which is free from external regulation. But if we come at this and we set out through media law and policy to uphold the interests of news consumers, or what I call news citizens, we're likely to address these questions in a very different way. We might say that news citizens have a considerable interest in receiving political information that is accurate and free from distortion, and that news publishers should therefore be externally regulated to ensure that the public do indeed receive such information, or that at least they are more likely to receive accurate than inaccurate information. We might also say, noting the risk of censorship, we might say that any model of external regulation must be subject to checks and balances to mitigate any such risk of political control. But we would not on principle be opposed to state involvement in the establishment or oversight of any such regulatory framework. Now, for me, sitting over pizza in Stirling 7 or 8 years ago now, I think, this was a bridge too far. Onora had turned my principles upside down. She'd unsettled me. But most importantly, I have to say, she had made me think. And that thinking went on for several years after that initial conversation. And Onora also helped Sir Brian Leveson to think when he was asked by the British government to address the scandal of phone hacking by certain newspapers, certain national newspaper groups. Leveson looked at the system of self-regulation, which we've had in the UK for almost half a century. He asked why that system had been so unable and apparently unwilling to investigate and address allegations of phone hacking and other abuses of journalism. He concluded that the system of self-regulation was flawed, and that whilst we should keep press regulation out of the hands of politicians, we should also keep it out of the hands of newspaper owners. And in his report, Leveson quoted Onora, who had told him that self-regulation is too easily blurred into self-interested regulation by newspaper owners. And Leveson clearly agreed. So in place of that pure form of self-regulation, he recommended a system of what he called independent self-regulation, or what's often called co-regulation, whereby a self-regulatory body is overseen by a statutory body. The regulator itself is still independent of the state, the press is still utterly independent of the state, but the state takes responsibility for ensuring that the system as a whole is geared towards the truth-seeking interests of the public rather than the commercial or political interests of publishers. That's the theory. Let's go back to that bridge I mentioned earlier, the bridge between academic philosophy and other cultures. Onora crossed this bridge very successfully with her new ethics. She set out from a culture of academic philosophy in which rational argument is valued very highly. On the other side of the bridge, she encountered 3 quite separate cultures, each with their own very different attitudes towards evidence, argument, and truth. So let's go back and imagine that we're taking this journey with Onora. It's a bit like a kind of Norwegian fairy tale with a bridge and trolls and so on. Let's cross the first bridge. We find ourselves in judicial culture, a subset of legal culture. in the person of Sir Brian Leveson, an appeal court judge who chaired the public inquiry. As an appeal court judge, Sir Brian is trained to weigh competing evidence in the scales of justice. He's trained to test hypotheses against first principles and to apply a range of considerations when forming a judgment. He's valued for his disinterest, his dispassion, his lack of bias. Now, in these ways, judicial culture resembles academic culture, and perhaps it's unsurprising that Sir Brian was receptive to Onora's line of argument. So we successfully pass our first hurdle, our first challenge in this fairy tale, and we proceed to our next bridge, the bridge which leads into political culture. Not so straightforward. Politicians are not trained to weigh competing evidence, to return to first principles, or to act without bias. Quite the opposite. We value politicians for the way they exercise power according to certain values. In a democracy, political power is supposed to be exercised in the public interest, but we give politicians extraordinarily broad scope to interpret the public interest according to their own very different values. We don't expect them to reach consensus or to follow the evidence to a, quote, rational conclusion. Politicians are open to arguments, but those arguments will always be tested against their values or their purported values and their need to gain and retain power through election. And it's very rare in British history for politicians to challenge the press. Gaining and retaining power has depended or has been thought to depend too heavily on the support of certain newspapers. And even if, in fact, the press does not determine the outcome of elections, and I think the academic jury is slightly out on that one, the press certainly has the power to make life very difficult for politicians who displease it. But there were pretty unique circumstances politically in the UK in 2013 after Leveson published his report. The Conservative Party was in coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour Party was already receiving very hostile press coverage and thus arguably had nothing to lose. And at that point, the Leveson recommendations were implemented by politicians working across party lines. They put in place the legal operating framework for a future self-regulator. Now, some would say, and their critics would say, that these politicians were acting in narrow self-interest, that politicians have always wanted to muzzle the press and that they seized the chance to do so. However, this account, which I often hear when I'm debating with representatives of the press, conveniently ignores the fact that this framework, the post-Leveson framework, doesn't give politicians any control over the press or over press regulation. It asks them to take responsibility for establishing the framework for regulation, but it's very careful not to give them any power over that framework. In any case, whether they acted in the public interest or in self-interest, the result was the same. Parliament established the legal framework for Leveson's model of independent self-regulation, underpinned by Onora's account of communication ethics. So, we've crossed the bridge from academic philosophy, we've encountered judicial culture, which was welcoming, political culture, which was helpful, as it happens, for whatever reason, and now we encounter press culture, and here it gets really difficult. Just as academic culture privileges rational debate, judicial culture privileges evidence and justice, and political culture privileges values and power, so press culture obviously has its own norms. Press culture says that journalists in fact exist to speak truth to power, that journalists sit outside the political establishment, that the press is a kind of fourth estate which exists to hold the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary to account, and that therefore the greatest enemies of the press are agents of the state, chief among them politicians. Now, these norms may or may not reflect the reality of what journalists and news publishers actually do. They may be more like a comforting fairy tale about the importance of the press than an empirical description of what the press does. There is, for instance, a lot of evidence to show that parts of the press and the political establishment in the UK are much more closely aligned with each other's interests and values than this myth would suggest. But the myth is no less powerful for that. And I remembered when I was writing this that I think the CEO of Ford Cars, the enormous American automobile giant, faced with a clash between his strategy for the company and the culture that was at large within the company, famously observed that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I was thinking, does culture eat ethics? And I think, yes, but more than that, culture absorbs ethics. Or to put it another way, culture incorporates ethical elements in its dominant narratives. So press culture has very effectively absorbed certain ethical ideas over the past few hundred years. It doesn't matter whether or not a journalist has actually read Milton, Mill, Orwell. He or she has certainly absorbed the idea that the press holds the state to account and that therefore state regulation is anathema. Thus, the culture of the British press, and this is quite separate from the narrow self-interest of perhaps those 8 or 10 men who own the majority of the British press. This is the 100,000 journalists working within the press. That culture has largely, I'm afraid, turned against the ethical analysis promoted by Onora, enshrined in the Leveson report, and, unfortunately for me, embodied in my own organisation, Impress. Now, I designed Impress to be the regulator that Leveson recommended, independent of the press and politicians, but accountable to the public via a statutory oversight body, the Press Recognition Panel, which was set up by government but is operationally independent. And the role of that oversight body, the PRP, is simply to confirm that Impress or any other self-regulatory body which puts itself forward satisfies the Leveson recommendations. And last October, the PRP did confirm that Impress meets that standard, satisfies those recommendations, and we thereby became the first recognised regulator in British history. And just to be clear about the facts here, Impress has no jurisdiction over the press in general. We simply resolve complaints and disputes in relation to those news publications which voluntarily sign up to us. And we've so far been joined by about 70 publications from across the UK, which together reach around 3 million people per month in print and online. Now, these are respectable audience figures, but they're tiny in comparison to the market share of the national and regional newspapers, which continue to dominate the industry and its culture. And because those newspapers are at the heart of that culture, they refuse to join Impress. They have spurned the Leveson recommendations, and they have persuaded the government with which they are apparently at such odds, they have persuaded that government to pledge to undo the cross-party work that was done in the wake of the Leveson Inquiry back in 2013. So in many ways, it looks like we may be back where we started. Now, we could condemn this response as self-interested. We could say that the journalists who have rejected Impress are malign, unethical. But I don't think that would be fair or accurate, because press culture is not unethical. It is, in fact, built upon clear ethical foundations. It maintains that journalism serves society. On this much, at least, press culture agrees with Onora. However, press culture says that journalism serves society by standing outside society. It says that a free marketplace of ideas, however dysfunctional, is preferable to a regulated marketplace. It takes certain assumptions as gospel truths, that politicians always want to censor the press, that editors are always the best guardians of journalistic standards, and that state involvement in press regulation is therefore simply unthinkable. So, on one hand, we have the culture of the press, which has absorbed and remodeled in its own image certain ethical norms. Now, these norms are held as truths by members of this culture, regardless of the fact that professional ethicists, such as Onora, have rejected them. On the other hand, we have what I call the new ethics of communication, or the new ethics for communication, proposed by Onora, accepted by many of us here, endorsed by Sir Brian Leveson, and embodied in my own organisation, Impress, and the legal framework that was created by Parliament back in 2013. It feels like an unbridgeable divide. Where do we go from here? Does it matter that this bridge between culture and ethics seems to be so broken? Yes, I think it does. Should we expect the press to embrace a challenging new ethical analysis with open arms? No. Should we expect philosophers to retract such an analysis simply because it has been rejected by the press? No. Should we look for more opportunities for engagement between these two worlds of academic philosophy and news publishing, both of which, to be fair, have their cultural and their ethical dimensions, their blind spots, their preferences, their biases? Yes, we should look for more engagement, but I'm afraid you shouldn't hold your breath expecting that to happen anytime soon or to any great extent. And in fact, to conclude, I have to say, I suspect that if anything is going to change this debate, I think that game changer will probably come from somewhere else entirely. All cultures are geared against change, but they do respond eventually to pressure. Perhaps not to philosophical pressure, sadly, but certainly to economic pressure. And the press is currently bowing, if not quite collapsing, under that pressure as audience attention and advertising revenue flows away from the old media institutions and into the pockets of the new media giants, and dominant among them, Google and Facebook. Now, in response, in the UK at least, I don't know if it's the same in Norway, the press are calling for, guess what? Regulatory intervention against the media, just not against their part of the media, but against Google and Facebook. And in order to justify these interventions, representatives of the press are appealing to arguments which I think are, rather ironically, quite like Onora's. They draw our attention to the harm that can be caused by the circulation of hate speech online. This is harm that's caused to the audience, of course, not to the exponent of hate speech, whose rights are apparently now secondary. The press deplore the use of social media by terrorists and their sympathizers on the basis, of course, of the harm that terrorists cause to society. And they rail against the rise of fake news, aided and abetted by intermediaries such as Facebook and Twitter. Now, in all of these examples, the growing critique by the old news media of the new news media is grounded in an appeal to the needs, interests, and rights of the audience, of society, not those of the speaker or their intermediary. So, just as the press have been capable of taking and absorbing elements from the old ethics for communication, so it seems they're quite capable of taking and absorbing elements from the new ethics for communication when it suits them. Perhaps they're nothing more than intellectual magpies, attracted by shiny and useful ideas that they can collect and take into their nest and use as they see fit. But at least there is this. Their shared use of this new ethical language creates an opportunity, an opening, it may be a very narrow one, but an opening for dialogue. If we're all talking about the interests of the audience, of society as a whole, then at least we are all talking. And if our conversation leads to some shared thinking about the regulatory framework, the future regulatory framework that might best meet those needs, taking into account the role played by both the old news media and the new news media, then I think we're really talking. Thank you.